So today we are with an unusual guest and an unusual topic. We are going to speak about the public policy in the US, how to get involved in it, what's happening, and how does it affect. William, could you please introduce yourself and what do you do for business?
Certainly. My name is William Kovacs. What I do for business for over 40 years, I was involved in public policy, both as a lawyer, a chief, or as a senior executive in a trade association, the chairman of an environmental board, and in private law practice. So I had a lot of experience as well as a counsel on Capitol Hill. For the last 3 years, I've been writing a book, writing 3 books, actually. 2 are published. And what I wanted to do after 40 years is that I saw an enormous amount of conflict, as you might call it, fake news, polarization, whatever you want. But it seemed like in the political world and public policy world, everyone wanted to focus on politics. They wanted to focus on me winning and you losing. But that really doesn't do anything for the public. So what I decided to do was to write about policy, because politics is about me winning and you losing. Policy is about how we do something to help the constituents, the citizens, the nation address the problems that they have. And the 2 books that I've got, and I'll sort of advertise them a little bit. The first one is it's called Reform the Kakistocracy, ruled by the least able or least principled citizens. And the reason why I wrote this book is because if you go to Amazon someday, and out of the 7 or 8 million books that they have, you might find 1 or 2 on public policy. You're going to find the rest on politics. And so I wanted to get into what are some of the ways you can get into making government work, controlling or having some management control over the people you elect. And why are they there? Are they there as politicians to help political parties, or are they there to be fiduciaries to the people and to the country? And the second book, this was just a lot of fun. It wasn't as serious. The first one took a lot of work and a lot of thinking. And it's called The Left's Little Red Book on Forming a Green New Republic. And it's a little bit different. It's about the manipulation of language, how politicians and interest groups manipulate words for their own benefit. And that's pretty exciting, because especially in the United States, where you have the words red and green, everyone wants to be green. But if you go back and you look at what they're actually saying, they're not talking about green in the sense of let's be an environmentalist, let's make sure we don't have pollution, let's clean up our rivers. They're talking about how can we get subsidies from the government, how can we get dominion over certain groups of people. And so what I wanted to do is, and the reason for the Little Red Book, is I followed what Mao did. I took a series of quotations as to what these people actually said so people could read them. And when you read them, they're not talking about something green, or they're not talking about truth. They're talking about domination. And I wanted to get that point across. And the only way to do it was to actually quote from the individuals who made these statements. So that's what I've been doing, and we can start the questions, but it's been a lot of fun. I have another one coming out probably next year, and we can do another interview on that.
That is more than awesome. Could you give us a little idea about the new book?
Sure. Well, the new one is gonna focus mainly on very specific ways, things that you can act. I mean, the first book talked about what are the policies, a little bit more general, but for example, should you be a fiduciary versus a politician? How do you restructure the federal government? But they were really, not complex, but they were all policies to get you into what it is and that there are options out there for changing. And the next one is really going to talk about what are the mechanics of the change.
That is more than awesome. So could we start with the simple things, like what is public policy?
Sure. Public policy is nothing more than working in the operation of government, whether it be legislation, regulation, investigations, permit writing. How does government work? How is it funded? And what do you do to keep it working? And I think when you look at it that way, you have to ask yourself, and I keep on coming back to the same fundamental question, are you going into government to make it work for people, or are you going into government to get yourself rich, get yourself connections? And the unfortunate thing is, at least in the United States, the most of the people who are there for the connections and the wealth. They're not there any longer to make the system work. Our system is not working.
So from your point of view, like how can you, let's say, how does public policy manifest? What do you want to see to say that these people are working for the public?
What you want to see is, I mean, I use the ideas, are you getting elected to serve the political party, or are you getting elected to be a fiduciary? And if you're going to be a fiduciary, that means you don't care what the party does. You're working at what is best for the citizens that you represent. Whereas if you're working for the party, you're into an election, you want them to win, and you want them to have control. Because in the United States, for example, if you become president of the United States, we've just had an election, as you know, if you become president of the United States, you control the distribution of somewhere between $4 and $7 trillion. Imagine the power that you have. I'm not talking about the nuclear weapons or anything like that. I'm talking about just the sheer distribution of money. And that money flows through the government, it flows through and it flows out. And they have a lot of discretion as to who gets the money.
Okay, so my next question would follow exactly from this question. Like, what main principles would you suggest for the government to follow so that you can say it is working for the public?
Well, first of all, I think you need to say, is $4 trillion, which is their budget every year, isn't that enough? And the United States this year, we're probably going to spend closer to $7 trillion. We have a debt of around around $28 trillion, which is about $165,000 for every man, woman, and child in the country. And you ask yourself, do we need this? Do we need all of these programs? Is there some way? The second question is, do we need the federal government as large as it is? Do we need them in every branch of government? One of the things we have in the United States is we have a federal government. They make the laws and enforce them. Then we have a state government. They follow the federal laws, but sometimes they do state laws and then they enforce it. Then you have local governments. How many levels of government do you really need? And the question that's so fundamental in this issue is government best handled when it's closest to the people? And so why is the federal government in Washington, D.C., with no relationship to the people, even though it has offices everywhere, they don't really have a relationship to them. The person who, in my local community, for example, is, if I've got an environmental problem, I'm not going to the federal government, I'm going to the county. I mean, the county collects my garbage. The county is the one that educates my kids. And so the question is, why is the federal government giving, let's say, states 10% of the education budget, but controlling 100% of what happens in the states? And the question is, one, should the states be taking the 10%, or should just say, we're going to take it? Because a lot of the times the mandates that are put on by the federal government are so onerous, the 10% is a fraction of what they get. And the best example is probably in the environmental field. Federal government puts in about 20-25% of the money, but for that 20 or 25%, the states have to administer hundreds of programs costing them roughly 75% more. Gives you an idea. A lot of it is just restructuring government to make it work. The question is, do we need all of the debt that we have? This debt, I mean, right now, look, I, as an old guy, I'm not going to be around when the bill comes due, but what's going to happen to all these people who are 15, 18 right now, 20, 25, 30, because that debt's going to come due. And there's a lot of talk in the United States, oh, we don't have to pay it back, we've got our own currency. Well, at some point in time, if you're going to trade with the world, the debt's going to come due. And when it comes due and we can't pay it, what happens? Do we default in the dollar? Do we default in the country? Do we default on our debts? Do we not pay the bonds? These are pretty serious things, and anybody who doesn't think about them is crazy. And the fact is, in the last election, we had a president run, we had the entire House of Representatives, and we had 34 Senate seats. Not one person discussed the $28 trillion debt of the United States or how we're going to pay it back.
So in an ideal world, how would public policy look like?
Well, I think one of the things I'll do is I'll go back and I'll give you a promotion for my book. But if you just go really into part 2 of the book, I lay it out very simply. One, We need a federal governance policy. And again, that is, what are the responsibilities of government? And the argument that I make is, if you're in government, you don't have any rights. You only have obligations. You're there to serve. You're not there to gain. So that's number one. And that's when I always talk about the fiduciaries versus the politicians. Number two, the privileges of what I call the Kakistocracy, they've got to be abolished. Why do these people have the kind of access to money and friendship that no one else has? Let's just be simple. We've got, if you look at the Speaker of the House and the chairman of the ranking member of the Senate Judiciary Committee, you're going to find several things. One is their husbands are always getting the largest grants that there are. Their businesses are always getting something. Even in some of what we call the Quad, this new gang of four who think they're really helping the people. Look who got the PPP loans. One of their husbands got $700,000. You don't get $700,000 by yourself. You get $700,000 because you have a connection. And I think I'm going to tell you a little story, and I probably am digressing too far. Years ago, when I was practicing law, I represented a man who had just left Congress. Actually, he didn't leave voluntarily. He was indicted, went to jail, and then I was representing him. Then when he came back, I was having dinner with him, and I said, why did you ever do what you did? How could you be that stupid? And he said to me, Bill, you don't really understand. When you're in government, everything in the world that's good happens to you. It just happens. You get the best, partnership in a real estate transaction. The road is built near wherever you own farmland. Your kids get a scholarship to school, and you don't even live in the real world. You live in a world in which you think whatever you do is just okay, and government's got to change. Continuing down the list, there have to be checks and balances in the branches of government. There have to be. And one of the things that's happened in the United States is, over the last 50, 60 years, the Congress, because keep in mind, their goal is to get elected by party. And one of the things the Congress has done is delegated great amounts of their authority to the executive branch. And so right now, it's the executive branch through regulation. And through regulation means these 200, 300, 400,000 bureaucrats who write regulations. Nobody knows who they are, but they're making the laws, because every regulation in the United States is a law. The second thing is, which is probably more important, is when you read the Constitution, it has provisions in there like, you can only have a war in the United States if Congress declares war. Well, Congress hasn't declared war since the Korean War, and we've been in 17 wars for $7 or $8 trillion. So the question is, we've got to have a true separation of powers, and each branch has to stay within what it does. And for that to happen, you really have to break up the political parties so that the person is acting as a fiduciary. What does the American people want? What do my constituents want? Not what does my party want or what does my president need to get reelected? And so we need to bring that power back. And once you do that, frankly, we're going to have fewer wars. We're going to probably spend less money because there's going to be some control in the system. The courts in the United States have to voluntarily limit their control. Let's just take a simple thing. In the courts in the United States, literally from the first day the Supreme Court met, they were making laws that they had no authority over. And one of the first acts of the Supreme Court was to install what they call sovereign immunity on the government. Well, that means if something happens to me, I can't sue the government. I can't sue the federal government. But what's so interesting about that is, when I can't sue them, they're separate from me. They're no longer my government. These are a group of people who are totally separate from anything and everything that I do. And if I want to get access to them, I can't sue them. So they're separate. And one of the things we have to do is we have to begin ranking in the courts, because the courts shouldn't be able to be that powerful. And it's not even a question of that. Right now, we even have federal courts, which are courts of district courts, are courts of very limited jurisdiction. only in the district in which they operate. And sometimes that's only a few counties. And they issue nationwide injunctions, which affect everyone in the entire United States. And they just do it. And there's nothing very little you can do to control them. One of the things, laws must be reduced and simplified. Well, is it really that hard to say? We have in this country about 400,000 regulations. We have an income tax code that is somewhere or close to 100,000 pages. And yet there's the presumption that everyone needs to know the law. I mean, this is ridiculous. And there's got to be some way in which we can begin making it simple. And again, when we had a part of the conversation earlier was I said, do you really need a law at every level of government? Do you need the same law at the federal level, the state level, and the county level? Or should we distribute powers to the people who are, to the governments that are most able to utilize that power? Government must focus on priorities. Everything can't be important. So often that what happens in government is, you're my friend, so I want you to get a contract. You're my friend, so you need a federal job. We've got to have priorities. We only have so much money. And if we're appropriating every year $4 trillion, why do we have to borrow an extra $3 to spend? Can't we live on $4 trillion a year? I mean, that's really the fundamental question. Government must be transparent and understandable. 400,000 regulations is not transparent. There's nothing about it. But if you really, for example, if you're debating an issue, one of the things the government does, especially the federal government, is they don't make everything available. What they make available to you is the studies that support the position that they want to take. And all of the other studies are then hidden, and you can't get them. And if you're trying to do a rulemaking, let's say you're trying to do it with the public comment period in 90 days, and they say, well, we're not going to give you the studies and you have to sue. Well, if you're going to have to sue, it's going to take 4 years. So you're not going to get the information in 90 days when you need it. It's really got to be transparent, and they've got to disclose. The other thing they should be disclosing is how much money they're all spending and when they're spending it, how much money they're getting in contributions from the political people. Right now in the US, we have a thing called dark money. There are some certain people who have to disclose that they give, but most of the people who give the millions of dollars don't have to disclose. That has to be disclosed because we don't know who really is at this point in time running our government. And then finally, government needs to operate it for the public purpose. And so if I had to say, these were my principles of government, and then we can get into proposals as to how you would restructure the government. And I don't know if we have time in a short interview, but just one of the things that let me give you an example is in the federal government, we own hundreds of thousands of buildings. We own when I say we, the federal government owns roughly about 60% of all the territory, all the land in the West. They have so many buildings and so much land, they can't even take care of it anymore. We can't even take care of our national parks. And it goes back to, what is it that we're trying to do? If we're trying to take care of the national parks, do we need another 500 or 600 parks that we can't even take care of? And these are just fundamental questions as to how you run a government. And then the other thing is we need to get rid of what I would call the non-essential functions. So what does the government run? How many agencies do we have? We have hundreds of agencies. And since we've been regulating, I think the regulation started in 1882 till today, there's only been one agency in the entire federal government ever eliminated. I mean, you mean agencies that were put into effect in 1900 and 1910? Do they still have functions that we need in the internet age? And I think, are we using information as efficiently as we can? Look someday, if you ever have someone on, talk to them about what the computer system is like in the United States. Right now, they're talking about the hacks, which either came from, they say it's come from Russia, China, Iran. Who knows where it came from? The fact is the computer system we have hasn't been changed in the last 20 years. I mean, they're the kind of functions that we should be looking at.
Okay, so my question here, which public policy do you like the most?
Do I like the most?
Yeah.
I like it's a really small little policy called the Data Access Law, and it gives you the right to get data from the government. Unfortunately, while it's very broad in the data that you can obtain, the government makes you sue most of the time to get the data, and that's really a fundamental problem. I'm very big in transparency in government. If our money is going there and you're working for us, why are you hiding everything from us?
Yeah, that is true. So my other question is totally the opposite. Which public policy do you see like the most hurting?
I think the what's hurting the most is the structure of the federal income tax. It has created massive inequality in the United States. We have probably the wealthiest 1% own about 40%. And there's this constant fighting of how the rich get more tax breaks and how the poor don't pay taxes. That seems to be the argument. What they're, one, the poor pay a lot of taxes. They just pay payroll taxes, and they're very expensive for the income that the poor have. And the people that are wealthy, we're not talking about wealth in the sense that, you know, you've got $1 million or 2 million or 3 million. We're talking about people who have close to $1 trillion or hundreds of billions of dollars, and they virtually are able to escape most of the taxes because the money comes in capital gains, which isn't taxed until the security is sold, or there's a reduction in the estate tax so that they're passing it on from generation to generation. And people always say, well, what difference does that really make? So what if they pass it from one family to another? They're going to pay taxes eventually. Well, if you have $100 and that's your savings, and you die and you have to pay $5 in taxes, but I've got $1 billion and I die and I can keep that and pass it from generation to generation. That's an enormous amount of just interest every year. So what happens is, and that's why you have the 1% owning so much and everyone else owning so little, is because the fact that they can accumulate such massive amounts of money puts them in a position where they just amass wealth and no one else does, because their money has to go to food.
So my question here, the next point, what specific questions would you like to ask the government?
Well, I mean, today I would ask them, you know, are we? I think that I do two things. One is, in the book, I call it the politicians to get elected allow what I call an automatic withdrawal from the Treasury. So, for example, look, we all get Social Security in this country, but we just give it and give it and give it. And no one has ever asked the fundamental question, well, how does this relate to the overall debt structure? How does this relate to the overall health structure? So when you have it, you've got to ask the fundamental question, does everybody need it? I mean, if you've got $1 billion and I have $100, I get the same Social Security you do. And the question is our system really graduated? And one of the things that's happened is I may be paying in on Social Security I think it's up to $120,000 US dollars. But somebody who's making $1 billion only pays in the same amount. So my taxes on my income might be a real 6.2%. Their tax on their contributions to Social Security is probably a fraction of a percent. And so, but they're still going to take it out at the end. And so there's some fundamental questions. And I think the other question that really is bothering everyone in this country is the healthcare system here is so out of whack. We don't even have an idea as to what to do. We don't use technology. For example, if you and I went to, let's say we both had a hip operation, we needed a hip operation. You could go to one hospital and the hip operation may cost you, same operation may cost you $10,000. And I went to another hospital, it might cost me $110,000. How is that possible? In the healthcare system, they don't have to tell us what it costs. They don't have to tell us when they're going to send you a bill. They don't have to tell you about any surprises in the bill. They don't have to tell you anything. They just send it to you. And one of the problems that I have is we can't control expenses, yet the government probably picks up, I'm going to say 30, 40% of the entire health bill in the country. And no one ever asks, how do we begin bringing the system into some kind of balance so that you don't have 10 or 12 million people with no insurance who really can't get any treatment at all. Or if they do get treatment, they get the most expensive treatment because they go to a hospital. And the reason a hospital is so expensive is because they have all kinds of services there. And you, every time you go in as an uninsured, have to pay for part of all of those. And what happens is, since the person can't pay anyway, the bill is sent to the American people. So we're not even paying, we're paying the most for service. Whereas we might be able to send them to an urgent care where it's $50 or $60, but the urgent care won't take them because they don't have insurance. So they go to a hospital and the bill is $50,000 or $60,000. I mean, the system just makes no sense. And we've got to find some way, especially in the healthcare, especially in the pandemic, to get people who don't have healthcare in. And you have to ask fundamental questions. For example, the cost of just the administrative costs, the paperwork costs to the healthcare system is around $500 billion. 500 billion. That's just paperwork. Do we need all that paperwork? I mean, again, coming back to we're a technology society. Do we need all that paperwork flowing? Go into an office. I mean, years ago, 20 years ago, when my kids were younger and you'd take them to the doctors, you'd walk in and you'd have the doctor, they'd have a nurse, they'd have your paperwork, they put it in a file, and then the doctor would give you his services. Today, you walk into a doctor's office and they might have 5, 6, 8, 10, 12 people just doing paperwork, because the paperwork is about 25% of the cost of all medical treatment. Is there some way in which, using technology and transparency, to get rid of that? And one of the reasons why that it is so expensive is because everybody bills by a code, and then the code goes to insurance, and the insurance has to decide whether or not that was part of their policy. But if you had transparency and you and I knew that this hospital was doing the hip transplant for $10,000, we'd be going to the hospital for $10,000. But they won't do that because the medical profession has so much control, lobbying control, that you can't really make the kind of changes. They need to use technology. They need to use transparency, and we need to know what everybody's doing so that we can then go in and make our decisions. Because if you and I both made a decision to go and get our hip replaced for $10,000, you're going to lower the cost of the system dramatically. And then if you can keep the people out of the hospitals and send them to urgent care, you're going to lower the cost. And these are just practical things. There's nothing tough about any of this stuff. It's just sitting down and honestly understanding, what is it that we're trying to do? Are we trying to protect the American Medical Association, or are we trying to protect our constituents? And I will argue that Congress and the American government have no concern at this point in time for protecting constituents. They only want to protect political parties and getting reelected.
And what would you tell the people to be more aware of this issue?
Read, get involved. Anything you can do to be involved, get involved. It doesn't matter where you are, what you do. If every person in your country and my country picked one issue, look, that's even complex. If every member of your parliament and every member of my Congress all picked one issue and said, you know, when I'm there, my issue is going to be healthcare, or my issue is going to be priorities, or my issue is going to be making sure that Congress has no wars unless they declare. Just those simple things. If one person really just said, that's the issue that I'm going to take for the next 2 years or whatever I'm elected for. What a difference it would make. And I think if every person in every community picked up an issue, one issue, it doesn't matter, it doesn't matter whether it's clean water, access to food, transportation costs. How do you make things better? People need to begin. And why I love public policy is public policy. When you get to the policy, public policy is about solutions. Politics is about conflict. And we need to get to solutions.
So it has been awesome talking to you, William, with these amazing thoughts about the public policy.
Okay, thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.